Hello and welcome to the Death Guard series. In this video I want to take a look at a type of list that we haven't looked at before for the Death Guard, in this case being a Terminus Est Assault Force. And this is an army of renown, so like all armies of renown, the Terminus Est Assault Force does have some benefits and detriments to it. So let's take a look at what those different benefits and detriments are. To begin with, like any army of renown, it gains access to special warlord traits, special relics, stratagems, and even psychic powers, as Death Guard is a psychic army, despite the Death Guard's hatred of psychic abilities within the lore. And in addition to all this, it does gain some special army-wide rules, though those are rather tame in comparison to some other armies of renown. And don't forget, those special rules come with some special detriments. So let's take a look at what the detriments are for the Terminus Est Assault Force. To begin with, you are not allowed to use any vehicles, which does actually help out the Terminus Est a little bit, as recently some of the rules changes within the 40k game set have hurt the Plague Burst Crawler due to changes of ignoring line of sight. However, with that being said, I do think the Plague Burst Crawler is an incredibly powerful unit even at this point, as it still has a lot of very powerful direct fire, so don't count it out quite yet. Though other changes do also benefit the Terminus Est Assault Force, making it a little better, as Death Guard has gained benefits to their Terminator units, and overall Space Marine units have become better within the 40k 9th edition rule set. As such, I think you're going to see more Terminus Est forces going into the future, though I will not count out vehicle forces for the Death Guard either, as those are perfectly fine as well. It's just that the benefits have kind of brought up the Terminus Est to where the vehicle forces were prior to this. Now, after the restriction of not being able to play vehicles within a Terminus Est Assault Force, you are also prohibited from playing Mortarion within your list. Mortarion used to be an incredibly powerful unit, though has fallen off a little bit within tournament play, and as such, Army of Renown lists do not suffer quite as much as they once did due to the loss of that Mortarion. There are two other restrictions, the first one being that if you do have a Plague Company within your army, the Plague Company units have to be from the Harbinger's Plague Company. This does restrict some of your abilities, and this is probably the biggest detriment, in addition to the limit on vehicles for a Death Guard army, so this is definitely something you have to consider when building your force, as there are other Plague Companies that are very popular, such as Mortarion's Anvil and the Ferryman. Though the Harbingers are definitely not a bad Plague Company, and if you'd like to learn more about the Plague Companies, do check out my video on them specifically within the Death Guard series playlist. And finally, the last and final restriction does tie into the Harbinger's Plague Company, in that if you include Typhus within your army, he must be your warlord, though in exchange for this restriction, he does gain a benefit that is rather good, being that he gains the Harbinger of Death warlord trait from the special Terminus Assault rules for free and can take a normal warlord trait in addition to that specific trait, thus increasing the power level of Typhus, who is already a decent enough unit that was seeing fringe play, though within this army and the different benefits that he gains, he does become significantly better and becomes much more of an interesting use case scenario. Now, with that being said, what are the special benefits that you gain from the Terminus Est Assault Force Army of Renown? Well, as we've already covered, you gain access to those different relics, traits, and stratagems in addition to psychic powers. But what are the special army-wide rules that you gain from this Army of Renown? Well, they are rather straightforward and limited, being primarily the Outbreak Assault rules, which are essentially a set of rules that says when you're using strategic reserves, you pay an additional command point at every rank of strategic reserves, and then you put units into strategic reserves as normal. However, when you deploy those units, instead of using normal strategic reserve deployment, what you do is you essentially deep strike the units by setting them up anywhere on the table more than 9 inches away from any enemy units. This can be incredibly powerful, as all of a sudden it gives you access to certain things that your units couldn't do before, such as your Plague Marines being able to deep strike and your Chaos Possessed being able to deep strike as well. However, do keep in mind that the different Terminator units do have teleportation strike, so it's not as impressive for them, though at the same time, being able to deep strike some of your different forwarded Varions or Plague Marines does increase their power significantly, as all of a sudden so many of your units can deep strike and the command point cost is rather negligible considering it's only +1 command point across all of the different ranks. And as such, it does unlock a lot of different styles of play for the Death Guard forces who do have a little bit of trouble, sometimes in the mobility department, though this does function as a little bit of a supplement because, as mentioned before, those Terminators can still deep strike even in normal Death Guard forces without the usage of command points. However, that being said, do keep in mind that many of those other special benefits of the Terminus Est Assault Force, such as the psychic powers, stratagems, relics, and traits, are definitely worth it as well, in addition to a free warlord trait that Typhus gets when Typhus is your warlord, meaning that there are a lot of benefits to going within the Terminus Est Assault Force, other than simply the army-wide special Outbreak Assault rules. And those benefits do make up for a lot of the detriments that you have within the army, However, it is very much a judgment call for you to make whether you want to play a Terminus Est Assault Force or a more traditional Death Guard army, as there are definitely benefits and detriments to both of those. So that's a very good place for an army to be, as it gives you the option of playing one or the other without locking you into either one of them specifically. With the special benefits and detriments of the Terminus Est Assault Force covered, let's take a look at the list itself. This list came in second place out of 22 players, piloted by a player named Chris Clanton in the Enter the Training Cages Rogue Trader Tournament, which was held on April 17th in Amsterdam of the Netherlands. To begin looking at this list, as we mentioned before, it is an army of renown and it is a Terminus Est Assault Force. As such, it does have the Harbinger's Plague Company, as the restrictions mandated to be such. This army features 1 battalion detachment, and it begins with its HQ choices. And to begin with the HQ choices, the first HQ choice is Typhus himself. As the restrictions once again state, he is the Warlord and he does gain the free Harbinger of Death Warlord trait. This is a free trait that says enemy models within 3 inches with 7 or less leadership don't count as having objectives secured and cannot perform actions. This is a great way to disrupt a lot of enemy objective holding units, as a lot of them might be weaker units that are specifically used for that purpose. Though in addition to that, it can disrupt a lot of enemy actions, and it can be a very interesting ability, especially when you consider you gain it for free. Though it does have a very limited range, which makes it a little bit difficult to use, which is probably why it is considered a free ability. In addition to the Harbingers of Death, Typhus has been assigned the Shamble Rot Warlord trait, which is the Warlord trait he is restricted to, and this Warlord trait comes from the Harbinger's Plague Company. This is a special Warlord contagion, and it basically allows it to deal some bonus mortal wounds against enemies that are within range of this Warlord contagion. And that is all for his Warlord traits and relics. I would have liked to see him carry the Infected Remains, as it would have been a bit of a fun relic to use, which allows him to create a zone that mimics his Shamble Rot ability, which can be rather annoying for some opponents when you have 2 to 3 different zones, depending on which stratagems you use to set up different Shamble Rot procs. It doesn't stack, however, and Typhus is a bit of a slow moving unit, so there are definitely detriments to using it in that sense, and I can definitely see why it's left off, but for me it's one of those fun little items that you can throw on Typhus and have a lot of fun with when using the Shamble Rot Warlord trait. Though I won't fault anyone for not using it, and I can definitely see it being more of a detriment than a benefit in many different games, so that's just something that I would personally do for the fun of it, and not something that I would recommend for many players. As for psychic powers, as Typhus is a psyker, he does come with 2 different abilities that he knows, one being Pernicious Dose, which is a Terminus Est specific psychic power, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to select a friendly unit within 6 inches, and that unit rerolls hit rolls with plague weapons. This is a very powerful ability, as it can allow some of your more powerful units to reroll their hit rolls and be a lot more consistent within combat. In addition to the Pernicious Dose, he does have the Rotwind psychic power, which is yet another Terminus Est psychic power, showing kind of the power of the different Terminus Est abilities that you have on offer. This psychic power says that he can select an enemy unit within 18 inches, and that enemy unit's armor penetration characteristic on its attacks is lowered by 2 to a minimum of 0. This is actually once again very powerful, as armor penetration is incredibly good within the 9th edition rules, and being able to reduce the armor penetration of an enemy unit can significantly hamper their ability to output damage. Usually abilities like this simply state that an armor penetration value is treated as 0, but in this case it's actually lowered, so it does give it a lot more utility to target different units with higher armor penetration values and bring them more into the range of a weaker weapon, thus giving your already very durable Death Guard units even more durability, making it an incredibly difficult challenge for your opponent to clear out your units. Moving on from Typhus, we come to the second HQ choice of this army list, that HQ choice being a Death Guard Demon Prince. This Demon Prince has been given the Folded Wings, which gives him quite a lot of mobility, as well as the Hellforged Sword, which is a very popular option for Demon Princes with those wings. Now, this Demon Prince has also been given an extra Warlord trait, being Rotting Constitution from the base Death Guard Codex. This Warlord trait gives the Demon Prince +1 toughness, bringing him up to 7 toughness total, and it treats enemy armor penetration of 1 and 2 as if it was armor penetration 0, once again greatly increasing the durability of that Demon Prince, who is already a rather durable model. And as you can clearly see, as I mentioned before, in this case the armor penetration isn't lowered, but simply certain armor penetrations are treated as a 0 value, so it does have a little bit less utility when your opponent has armor penetration 3 and above. However, considering you gain that additional toughness and the other durability abilities that Demon Prince has, it's still a perfectly fine Warlord trait and can be a very big headache for your opponents to deal with when put on a Demon Prince with wings that can do serious havoc within melee combat. The Demon Prince is also a Psyker, and he has one psychic power, in this case being Accelerated Entropy, and Accelerated Entropy is once again a Terminus Est psychic power, and what it says is you can select a visible enemy unit within 12 inches, and you and your opponent both roll a d6 and add your respective toughnesses. In this case, your toughness is a little bit higher because of that Rotten Constitution, so you can see how those two abilities kind of stack to make this ability a little stronger. And then once you've added your toughness in your roll, you compare your roll against your opponent's roll, and if you win this roll off, the opponent's enemy model takes 3 mortal wounds. However, if you double the result, they suffer d3 plus 3 mortal wounds instead, which can actually create quite a lot of mortal wounds. And considering this targets a model and not a unit, this can be targeted very effectively to take out certain priority units within an enemy's forces, thus giving you a lot of ability to kind of gain the advantage against your enemy and then bring in the Demon Prince to take out other enemies within melee. This is a very interesting combination of the two abilities, though both these abilities are perfectly fine even without being combined, so it's definitely well worth the price of taking both of these as an option within an army list, even individually without being coupled. And finally, there's one last HQ choice within this battalion detachment, that being a Plague Caster, as you've used up your other HQ options pretty much within the force. This Plague Caster has been given a bolt pistol and has been given the relic, which is a Terminus Est relic, being the Filth Sensors. The Filth Sensors are a pretty simple relic in that all it does is it adds 6 inches to the range of psychic powers that the bearer of this relic casts. This is a decent enough ability, and considering that the Death Guard psychic powers are rather short in range, this definitely helps out a little bit in that regard. Now, what psychic powers has the Plague Caster been given? The Plague Caster knows 2 psychic powers, and he's been given 2 psychic powers from the base codex and not Terminus Est powers in this case. The first of these powers is Miasma of Pestilence, which is pretty simple, and it's a psychic power that can buff your friendly units. What you do is you select a friendly unit within 18 inches, and it gives that unit a protective barrier that says enemy units making an attack against this unit get -1 to their hit roll, a decent enough ability and one that can really help your unit survive. The second psychic power is Curse of the Leper, and Curse of the Leper inversely is a very offensive power. What it does is it says select an enemy unit within 18 inches and visible to the caster. Once the spell goes off successfully, you roll 7d6 and deal 1 mortal wound to that enemy unit for each roll that exceeds the enemy's toughness. This definitely is an ability that wants to target lower toughness models, considering that once you hit a toughness of 3, only 50% of your rolls are going to successfully cause a mortal wound, which can be a little bit awkward, and once you get to higher toughness ratings than that, it does become that much harder to inflict those mortal wounds. So generally the best targets for this are going to be objective holding units that are small in size and have a lower toughness, but might have a decent save, as mortal wounds are much harder to save against than other attacks. Though that being said, even against higher toughness models, this could be just a decent way to sneak in 1 or 2 mortal wounds and do a little bit of extra damage before engaging with some other unit to wipe that unit out. It's definitely an interesting psychic ability, and it's one that you'll see is very popular within different Death Guard forces. Moving on from the different HQ choices, we come to the troop choices. And as this is a battalion detachment, there are going to be quite a few of those. The first of the troop choices is a unit of 5 Plague Marines, including 2 Plague Marines that are armed normally, 1 Plague Marine Champion, 1 Plague Marine armed with a double knife to give him a little bit more ability within close combat, and 1 Plague Marine armed with a Flail of Corruption. The Flail of Corruption is definitely a very powerful item that a lot of people like taking on both their Blightlord Terminators and their Plague Marines, as it can deal quite a lot of damage. The Plague Knife is nice as well, as it's an extra melee attack and has a little bit of benefit with certain stratagems, so this is a decently melee focused unit that is small in size and can do a decent amount of work. So it's definitely a nice unit to just include with an army, though I don't think it has any specific purpose other than being a solid enough unit. Following this unit of Plague Marines being a Terminus Est Force, there's obviously going to be quite a lot of Poxwalkers within the army, and as such there are 3 units of 20 Poxwalkers and 1 unit of 18 Poxwalkers. The Poxwalkers are definitely a very annoying unit for opponents to deal with, and in the combination of Terminus Est as well as Harbingers, they become all the more annoying. It's definitely something you never want to discount, as Poxwalkers can do quite a lot of work within a game, and are always going to be a big nuisance to any opponent playing against them. Though I will point out this is quite a lot of models, totaling a total of 78 models within those 4 troop choices. That can be quite difficult to move around on the tabletop during a game where you have a limited amount of time, as well as a rather difficult thing to paint and purchase, as it can get kind of expensive rather quickly. Luckily, Poxwalkers are not the most expensive models, though it still adds up rather quickly when you're fielding that much of them, and it can be a bit of a hassle to transport and move so do keep in mind all of that when building a list such as this, as there are the physical realities of this being a tabletop game and not a digital game where such squad sizes don't really mean anything. On the plus side though, if you like having a lot of zombies, this is definitely an army list that will give you a lot of joy, as you'll have a lot of fun with all those different units. And the Poxwalker models, as disgusting as they are, do actually look really cool and are a ton of fun to paint, as I painted a few of them and it was just a complete blast, because you can get really creative with how you paint them. And that pretty much covers the troop choices for this army. So let's move on and take a look at the different elite choices for this Terminus Assault Battalion. The elite choices will begin with a Biologus Putrefier. The Biologus Putrefier is a bit of an uncommon unit, though it does see a decent amount of fringe play, so it's not something you should discount completely. The Biologus Putrefier also has a decent amount of different buffs that it can give your units, which is always a nice benefit to have. In addition to that, this Putrefier has been given an extra Warlord trait, which is the Arc Contaminator Warlord trait. And the Arc Contaminator Warlord trait is an aura ability that says friendly Plague Company units within 6 inches can reroll the wound roll with plague weapons in melee, and they can also reroll plague weapon range attacks if they are within 12 inches of their target, and this just further allows the Putrefier to buff the unit that he is with. The Putrefier definitely isn't a bad model, it's just a little bit of a fringe model that has its use cases, though those use cases are a little bit narrow, so there's nothing wrong with taking one, and you'll definitely see them pop up from time to time, though they're not quite as ubiquitous as other folded variants within the Death Guard forces. Speaking of folded variants, this list includes 2 different folded variants, utilizing their special ability to keep them from having a force organization slot. The first of these non-force organization folded variants is the very ubiquitous Foul Blightspawn, who will probably show up in almost every Death Guard list, barring very heavy vehicle lists that don't include Terminators and Plague Marines, and even then he still might show up at times. The Foul Blightspawn is definitely a very threatening unit with a very powerful range weapon that has a random number of attacks as well as very powerful abilities that can make your opponents have a very hard time in melee. This Foul Blightspawn has been given an extra relic and a deadly pathogen. The relic that he has been given is the very common Revolting Stench Vats, which is pretty much a must-have on Foul Blightspawns and does allow him to be a very big nuisance within combat when enemies are trying to charge or attack first, as he prevents those benefits, thus making him a very big nuisance that keeps the enemy from wanting to charge into whatever unit he is supporting. In addition to this, he's been given the deadly pathogen known as Viscous Death, which I think I've originally called Vicious Death in a previous video. Anyway, with that little blunder aside, the Vicious Death deadly pathogen basically says that his plague weapon gets +1 strength, and that whenever he rolls a random number of attacks, he can reroll that roll and determine a new number of attacks. This is very good considering that the range weapon that the Foul Blightspawn comes with is essentially a flamer, so it has a random number of attacks, and it has a very high strength and armor penetration profile, making it an incredibly heavy hitting weapon, and the Viscous Death deadly pathogen is not that expensive, thus it couples very well with the Foul Blightspawn, and it is very common to see a Foul Blightspawn sporting this specific deadly pathogen, as it's one of those cases where it just kind of works out. Following the Foul Blightspawn, this list includes a Tallyman as a non-force organization slot using the folded variant ability. This Tallyman has no relics, warlord traits, or upgrades, which is a little bit of a curious inclusion, considering that the Tallyman is best served tallying for a specific model, usually things like Contemptor Dreadnoughts. Though that being said, it's not the worst inclusion, as he can still generate some command points and he can still be a decent enough support unit, so it's definitely a perfectly fine inclusion. It's just that the Tallyman is not going to be as powerful as he could be within other army lists that do include things like Contemptor Dreadnoughts. However, as a Contemptor Dreadnought as a vehicle, it is not eligible to be within a Terminus Est Assault Force, and as such, it does kind of weaken the Tallyman a little bit, though like I said, there's nothing wrong with including the Tallyman in the situation. Following the different folded variant choices, there are an additional 5 elite choices within this army list, which does make sense considering that the restriction of no vehicles makes it very hard to include things like fast attack choices and heavy support choices, which are primarily going to be vehicle choices, thus restricting you to mostly troop and elite choices within a Terminus Est force. The first 2 of the 5 additional elite choices are 2 units of 5 Death Guard Possessed, and the Possessed are incredibly scary melee units that can do a ton of damage to an enemy unit. However, one thing that always kind of slows down the Possessed is that it's very hard to transport them, and they aren't the most durable units when caught in the open to enemy fire. In addition to that, even though they move a little bit faster than other Death Guard units, the Possessed are still a tiny bit slow, so it does become a little hard to get them into position at times, However, do remember that Outbreak Assault ability that allows you to essentially deep strike units within strategic reserves, and all of a sudden the possessed become a lot more interesting within a Terminus Est Assault Force. And this is generally why you're not going to see possessed within a normal Death Guard army. However, they are very popular within Terminus Assault Forces. That being said, the recent changes to the Terminators within the Death Guard forces do make them a little bit more awkward, considering how much more powerful Death Shroud and Blightlord Terminators are now. However, the possessed do bring their own special thing to the table, so you shouldn't count them out quite yet. It's just that you have to make that consideration a little more heavily, and I really wish that the possessed had got objectives secured like the Death Shroud and Blightlords did within the recent rule changes, as they were already a unit that did see a very minimal amount of play compared to the two different Terminator units. In any case, I still think they're perfectly fine, and I think they're an interesting unit to utilize. Now for the last 3 elite choices within this army list. Those elite choices are 3 units of 3 Death Shroud Terminators with no upgrades. Death Shroud Terminators are an incredibly frightening melee unit, and are definitely a little bit more versatile than the Possessed will be in most cases, and generally the Possessed are going to be additional units of Terminators as opposed to being the primary focus. In this case, the Death Shroud are able to teleport strike in as normal, and they're able to be incredibly powerful units on the tabletop. They're very threatening within melee and incredibly difficult to take out. They also have the ability to clean out swarm units with those Plague Spurt gauntlets that they're armed with, and they can cleave through swarm units very well with their melee attacks as well as deal a lot of damage to heavily armored targets within melee. That being said, as you can see, this list does rely on getting within melee combat quite consistently, which does benefit from the Terminus Assault rules, though it still might struggle in some cases if your opponent can kind of maintain their distance and fire on your different units. That being said, considering that 9th edition is a very objective-focused game, you are able to sit on objectives and hold them very effectively with a list such as this. Though in some cases your opponent will still be able to take advantage of some of the weaknesses that Death Guard have naturally and are exacerbated within the Terminus Est Assault Force, as you are limiting your long-range firepower even more by not being able to include vehicles. And your mobility is a little bit limited even though you have the ability to deep strike in with more of your units. So as I mentioned before, there are definitely trade-offs to playing an army such as this in comparison to a more traditional Death Guard army. I will say with some of the rules changes, the Plague Burst Crawler has gone a little bit weaker, but it's still very, very viable, and I don't think it's something that's going to go away anytime soon because it's still a perfectly great unit. The one thing I'll say that I would have liked to see in an army like this is a unit of Blightlord Terminators, especially now with the new rules changes. Though that is still kind of a preference choice, and there are arguments to be made for including or not including them within an army like this, because they will dilute the focus a little bit if you do include them, and they are kind of a very expensive unit, even in a minimal size, and generally you're going to want some special weapons on them because that's kind of a draw to them, so that further pushes up their points cost, making them even harder to include in comparison to something like the Possessed. All in all, I do think it's a very interesting list, and I'll mention one other very interesting thing about this list, in that do notice that with the inclusion of Typhus, the Biologist Putrefier, the Plague Marines, and the multitudes of Poxwalkers, this list includes every single unit from the Combat Patrol box, even though it might not include every single Plague Marine, so this is definitely an interesting army to consider if you're looking to pick up the Combat Patrol box, as it does make heavy utilization of the different models within that box, thus giving it a little bit more value than you would otherwise get from it. However, all of the units within the Combat Patrol box can definitely see play within a regular Death Guard army, and you'll definitely be using a lot of those units within your different lists, so don't let a Terminus Est Assault Force such as this sway you significantly. Just keep it in mind, as it does give the Combat Patrol for the Death Guard forces a little bit more value. In addition to that, the problem with the Combat Patrol for the Death Guard has never been the value or the models included, it's just been that it's not as exciting as some of the Combat Patrols available for different armies that include a little bit more of a centerpiece model and can be a little bit more exciting for a player starting out. However, if you like the zombie themes and the Combat Patrol, this is definitely an army you should consider, and let me know in the comments below if you're more interested in the Terminus Est Assault Force style of army or in a more traditional style of Death Guard army when considering the Death Guard as a faction. In any case, thank you for watching, and if you know anyone who may benefit from this content, please do share, as it really does help the channel out, as well as those who may benefit from the content. As always, I want to give a big thank you to my patrons. You're all awesome people, and as always, have a great day. Bye.